Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Susan Comrie with the amaBhungane's Centre for Investigative Journalism. I'm not quite sure if you can see everyone on screen or if you're seeing my presentation. If you can see everyone else, then you'll see my two colleagues, Dierwald van Rensburg, one of the journalists at amaBhungane, and Sam Sol, the managing partner at amaB. I'm gonna start with just a very short presentation to begin with. Can I just get confirmation that you guys can see the first slide of my presentation? Great. Okay. So the title of our presentation is Investigating Iqbal Survé's Sekunjalo group. And I wanted to start with just a very quick kind of look at how we pick our stories, how we decide what we're going to investigate, because I think what we sometimes see from Twitter, and certainly what you can see from some of the headlines reflected on the screen, is that there's a lot of kind of there's some misconceptions out there about how we kind of go about our investigations. So this is my thinking about how we identify things that we're going to investigate, how we find our stories. I've kind of broken it down into different kind of sources of where information is potentially coming from. So the first one I want to start with is kind of what I call evidence on the ground. This is where something has happened. So for instance, a river has been polluted, a devastating fire has occurred. There have been protests on the ground about a stadium that's been built supposedly for 15 million rand, and it's very clear that it's not worth that kind of money. So the advantages of approaching a story in this way, approaching an investigation in this way, you already know that some harm has been done, justice has been done. So you kind of have a ready-made narrative of the story on the ground. But these stories are also quite hard because you're essentially starting from the point furthest away from, if there was a bribe paid, for instance, for that stadium, you're starting at the point furthest from that bribe. You're starting with the final effects that are happening on the ground. So that's kind of one of the sort of disadvantages of approaching an investigation in this way, is that it can be really time consuming, and your chance of converting it into a sort of successful investigation is lower, because sometimes it is just a needle in a haystack. Sometimes things have just gone wrong. There's not necessarily a bad guy or a company out there that you can really hold accountable. So one of the examples of this kind of investigation was one that Dierwald and I recently did, which was around the UPL warehouse fire in Durban. This was essentially where you had a warehouse that was torched during the protests, that it turned out was illegally storing kind of millions of liters of pesticides illegally. So, this was really something where we didn't approach it as we should definitely do an investigation. We rather approached it as saying, we can do a small public good. We can kind of, use some basic skills to track down who the company is that's responsible, and then use our position as journalists to say, look, disclose what's burning, what people are being exposed to. It kind of evolved into an investigation from there, because we realized once the company refused to disclose that there was something bigger there, something worth investigating. So another approach that one can take, sorry, we've gone one too far, would be what I would call kind of evidence or allegations of wrongdoing. This is where you've got kind of a source approaching you with a tip-off, saying, I know that so-and-so is paying a kickback in order to get a contract. I know that this company is laundering money, and here are documents that help to prove it. There's a lot of journalism that comes out of fishing from these types of waters, because your chance of success is much higher. You've kind of got the evidence already that some wrongdoing has occurred. And it's really a job of kind of verifying, piecing together. So you have a much higher kind of return on investment with those types of investigations, but they can be risky. I mean, I think we've seen, there's a lot of examples that we've seen from, things like the Sunday Times debacle and, other kind of journalistic debacles where you can be open to manipulation by sources. You have to be careful to make sure that you're getting a kind of full picture of the investigation and not just getting kind of what your source wants you to see by providing you with kind of limited documentation. So an example of that kind of story would be one that we did on the community work program, which started off as a tip-off, one of many that we get during the week. About one of the kind of government-appointed partners who was distributing contracts to companies belonging to friends and family. What we did, though, was we didn't just report on that particular allegation. We kind of combined it with another kind of source of sourcing, investigative material, which was by going through a PIA process to ask for all of the records of who was kind of benefiting from these CWP contracts. And that then helped us to kind of tell other stories, which weren't based on tip-offs from sources, but were based on what we could see for ourselves in this large amount of data. So this kind of takes me to the next sort of source of our investigations, which is really where you're talking about a large amount of data that's not being filtered through a particular source, who's not, you're not having someone telling you this is what you should, this is what I'd like you to see by looking at these documents. You've been given raw documents, raw data, whether it's through leaked emails, whether it's through a whole stash of leaked documents, whether it's through a PIA process, or even something as simple as, like the Office of the Chief Procurement Officer, the kind of records that they disclose on their websites. Things like that, they can be really great sources of investigations because you really are sort of, free to sort of determine your own course of your own investigation, to explore the research. You don't kind of have anyone of try and verify one piece of information, and it takes you down a rabbit hole that you can spend, an entire day getting lost. So an example, though, of the kind of investigations that we've done that have come out of these large amounts of data would be this one, which we did about the former Johannesburg mayor, Jeff Mkubo, and payments that he was receiving from Regiment's Capital for years. But as tends to happen with really good investigations, that they spawn other investigations. So for instance, in this case, we had Mkubo's response to us being published online, that then triggered a whole investigation about paid Twitter, about paid influencers on Twitter, and about how they were being used to kind of manipulate political narratives. So again, this is a story that's starting from a large data dump, but is kind of growing and changing and is spawning other stories coming from other places. In this case, coming from, an evidence on the ground kind of investigation. So the fourth one that I want to look at is kind of where we take a public interest investigation. This is where we take an issue, a topic, sometimes a company, a person, and we say, this is worthy of us dedicating time to investigate. These types of investigations are rare. They can be really time consuming. They can also have quite a sort of poor investment. Sometimes you might say, okay, I'm going to investigate Eskom. Well, where do you start? You don't necessarily know that there is something really valuable that you're going to find. You can do a lot of digging and not really come up with really sort of useful investigative material. But an example of the kind of where we have done these kinds of investigations would be with Steinhoff. So you'll see, for instance, the slide I've got up on screen. This was where we had made a decision to investigate what had gone wrong with Steinhoff. And we had actually put out a call to the public to say, if you have information, if you know what went wrong, if you know specific details about, who was in the room, these companies, then we want to hear from you. But I think it's worth remembering that even with an investigation like this, even where we have said we are going to look into Steinhoff, for instance, there was still something that had happened. There was still a sort of evidence on the ground that helped to trigger this investigation, because what had happened is the share price had collapsed. So we knew that something had gone wrong. This wasn't a case of kind of speculatively saying, let's dig in and see what we find. There was clearly something had gone wrong, which sort of helped to justify our decision to then say, let's focus on this more deeply and investigate. And then getting a bit delayed here with the lag. One more that I wanted to take you through is what I'd kind of call mimicry. This is basically taking investigations that have been done elsewhere and seeing whether the same applies to our own situation. It is something that works really well with kind of in-depth scientific research and things like that, where research has been done in other places and where you can take that as a roadmap and say, let's see if that's happening in our situation. One of the examples that I wanted to just briefly mention with that would be, we had done an in-depth investigation into SAP. That had come out of the Gupta leak, so had come out of a big trove of information. But something which, unfortunately, no one really seems to have picked up is that in SAP's case, the practices that they got caught with the Guptas, they were engaging with all over the world. You can see from this story that we did, there was an SAP executive who said that they complained at a global level because SAP in Africa was paying these massive fees and was paying them on all contracts. Now, that's kind of a clear roadmap. If you're sitting in another country in Africa, not in South Africa, if you've got government contracts that use SAP, I'd be asking questions. Did those contracts involve large business development fees? Because I think you'll find there's a very good chance that they did, based on the sort of trail of breadcrumbs that's already come out in South Africa. So that's kind of looking at where we source investigations from. The question is, how do you decide what you're going to investigate? And this is a tricky one, because we do literally get tip-offs every day. We get tip-offs from our tip-off line, and we have to kind of make quite brutal decisions about what we're going to investigate and what we're not going to investigate. Now, I'd say a lot of the time we do inherently know whether something falls within our area of interest, within amaB's priority areas. But essentially, we do an exercise every so often of kind of setting priorities, setting our own kind of Venn diagrams. What are the issues that we think are important? And how do potential investigations fit within our own priority areas? It doesn't necessarily mean that we only limit ourselves to that, but it helps us to give us an idea of where. The last thing is kind of when deciding whether or not to investigate. If something's less important and it's easy, you can immediately throw it out. That's not going to be something. Well, sorry, if it's less important and it's difficult, throw that one out. That's not going to be something that you want to spend time on. If it's very important and it's easy, you should definitely be doing that. That's a no-brainer. The question is when you have investigations that are important to do but are difficult. You don't want to be kind of overloading but fit into that sort of quadrant that are difficult but very important. You also don't want to be overloading your quadrant with your workload with investigations that are sort of easy and less important. You kind of want to pick and have a nice balance so that you can kind of make sure that you can publish stories without kind of driving yourself insane by never being able to get anything into print. But also tackling investigations that are important and sometimes taking on things that are going to be more difficult to do. Okay, so I'm going to stop there. That's kind of my 10-minute breakdown of explaining why we investigate, how we pick our investigations. I'm going to hand over to Sam, though, to sort of go into the sort of specific story that we're talking about here, which is the Sekunjalo group, and why we kind of decided that this fitted within our priorities and that this was worth our time and our resources to investigate.
Right, let me see if I can share my screen here. Okay, let's just go to full screen. Okay, so the question is why pick on, and that's those words are used deliberately because he complains to some extent that that we pick on Dr. Iqbal Survé and his companies, and you'll see some of the logic as to why we thought this was important. The background: media is a strategic and contested political terrain. I think we're seeing that globally more and more, how important the media is and kind of control of the narrative. Secondly, it was a target. The ruling complained about negative coverage, and the party sought to bring political, economic, and regulatory pressure on independent media. It even threatened to launch its own newspaper, but didn't. So we had that background context. Then again, along came this guy. So in fact, when I looked back for the first time, we as amaBhungane's had written about Iqbal Survé. It was in November 2011, and it was a story about how his company had and the Dr. Iqbal Survé. So that raised in the subsequent events. Newspapers was the biggest print group in terms of number of titles in the country. In 1994, it was taken over by Irish magnate Tony O'Reilly, with blessings from Mandela. So even, but then in 2013, O'Reilly sold the group, rebranded as Independent News and Media, to a consortium led by Iqbal Survé. And there were a number of red flags around this transaction. Firstly, Survé's Sekunjalo consortium paid too much. They paid and I think even back in 2013, we could see that print was under pressure. So that raised questions about whether was this a strict commercial deal or was it something else? Second red flag was that the deal was funded and adjudicated by the state-owned Public Investment Corporation. A number of the bidding companies bid with the PIC for funding, and it is essentially the PIC chose who was going to be the winner. In addition, the PIC took 25% equity. That was in addition to funding most of Sekunjalo's stake, and Chinese state-owned media companies took 20%. So you had 45% of this media company essentially being controlled by state-owned or state-linked entities. The next red flag was that the consortium, the Sekunjalo consortium, was packed with political actors, including ANC allied trade union investment vehicles and the Umkhonto we Sizwe Military Veterans Association. Finally, the final red flag around which kind of attracted interest was that the deal was shrouded in secrecy. It was very hard to get information about exactly what the terms are, who the people were, etc. So much so when we questioned and asked questions about details of this deal, this happened. We got a call from Dr. Survé himself, in which he accused the Mail and Guardian, which we were part of at that stage, and amaBhungane itself, raising the issue as to whether we were CIA. You can listen to the interview.
So you're saying that MNG is owned by the CIA? I'm not saying it's owned by the CIA. I'm asking you, is it? You guys are trying to figure this out. Yeah, I will do that.
That was Craig McCune, and to his credit, he went to the M&G owner, Trevor Ngube, and put the question, and the question was answered in the negative. We were not funded by the CIA. Finding out who and how the takeover of Independent was funded was a bit more difficult. So those issues raised concerns, and that same month that we made that report in August 2013, we wrote concerning the sale of Independent to Sekunjalo in a week that also saw Gupta TV, also known as ANN07, touted to the sale of South Africa's second largest press group by revenue. Sekunjalo should make Democrats sniff the air. Is it too fanciful to see a strategy driven by ANC centralizers and business people keen to curry favor with them, to use ownership as a way of bringing vigorous independent journalism to heel? And that kind of answered the question of, if you can't beat them, buy them. And I think the history of the group since then has borne out that concern. Only a year later, we carried another story looking at the damage, dubbed What's Black and White and in the Red All Over. The story noted that the PIC, which had 25% and it put up most of the money, was at that stage completely absent from the independent board, which was packed with Survé friends and family. We noted that there were already significant departures of skilled staff, and that there was plunging revenue, circulation, and morale. But in fact, we didn't do a lot of reporting beyond that in the next couple of years. And partly that was because the problem of reporting both the PIC and Independent was that they were black boxes that didn't publish detailed information about their financial situation and processes. But in 2017 and 2018, as Susan noted, something happened. That changed. There were two things. Firstly, a PIC whistleblower started sharing internal documents. And secondly, Survé Sekunjalo prepared to list two entities on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, the JSE. Two companies were involved in these listing plans. One was called IO Technology Solutions, and the other one was called Sagamata Technologies. Now, a good thing about a listing is that stock exchange rules require detailed disclosures. So the black boxes were opened somewhat. It also helps one to recognize a scam if you've seen it before, and we had. In 2014, we reported how the Gupta family had manipulated a listing to extinguish huge debts, hundreds of millions in debt to the Independent Industrial Development Corporation, which had funded their takeover of Shiva Uranium. Just to explain listings, listings are used to raise cash. If you've built the best ever mousetrap, but you need to raise cash to go into production, you can dilute your ownership of your own company by selling some shares in it. Supposing the 100 shares of your private company are fairly valued at 100 Rand. You could issue an extra 100 shares and sell them to the public. That means your share, your ownership of the company would drop to half, to 50%. And the fair value of the shares halves. If the public buys those 100 shares, those new shares at 50 cents each, then the value of your company increases to 150 Rand. Your 50% is now worth 75 Rand. But you also have 50 Rand that you've raised from the share issue to expand and help you go into production. But if people believe your mousetrap is the next big thing, they may be prepared, they may be persuaded to pay more than the fair value or the net asset value per share, which in our example we said was 50 cents. They may be prepared to pay a premium, like 1 Rand per share. That has the following impact. Your whole company with 200 shares now is valued at 1 Rand per share. And so it's worth 200 Rand in total. Your own 100 shares, your 50%, are now worth 100 Rand again. In other words, they're not worth any less than when you issued the extra shares. And your company now has 100 Rand cash to play with. That process of raising money and setting the value at which shares can be issued can be manipulated. And here's the script. Firstly, there's hype. You can try to impress the market by hyping up the value of your company. And here's an example of one of many articles that were published in independent titles about what a fantastic deal this was going to be and what a fantastic world-beating company Sagamata was going to be. But that's risky because you do risk not convincing the market. That you risk that the hype doesn't work. Another part of the script is to find a captive investor. This is much less risky. Captive investor in this sense is someone who's persuaded to accept a bloated valuation of your company. The Guptas in their case had the Industrial Development Corporation. Did they have them fooled, or was it something else? And post-state capture, the IDC is still in court trying to unravel that deal. Dr. Survé had this guy, Dr. Dan Machila, the CEO of the PIC, in his corner. Sagamata was touted as Africa's Amazon. It was the company that the loss-making independent media group was going to be injected into. The pre-listing statement, which the stock exchange rules required, was very detailed, and it disclosed that Survé was seeking to raise a minimum of 3 billion Rand via private placement. That's the sale of shares ahead of the public listing. And he was trying to raise that, he was planning to raise that 3 billion, despite the fact that the company was technically insolvent and laboring under the burden of some 2.3 billion Rand in debt. That included the debt to the Chinese and to the PIC from the original purchase of Independent. So who was going to invest in such a company that was starting life at such a disadvantage? the PIC. When we first got the pre-listing statement and saw what it said and what it was trying to do, we had a race against time. Sagamata was due to be listed on Friday, the 13th of April, 2018, perhaps appropriately. And although the company had a negative net asset value per share, in other words, its value per share, its fair value was actually in the negative, the PIC was planning to pay 39 Rand 62 cents per share, supposedly based on an independent valuation of the company's potential, its potential for growth, its potential for future profits. It was also going to swap the massive debt it was owed for funding the purchase of Independent for shares in the new company, Sagamata. That deal was stopped in its tracks. On Saturday, the 7th of April, we published our analysis of the pre-listing statement. On Monday, the 10th, just straight after the weekend, the JSE withdrew its permission for the listing to go ahead, citing technical reasons. And the PIC subsequently also later withdrew and is litigating. It can be controversial doing stories and investigations about other media. The backlash from Independent was swift. My face was splashed over their all their front pages with the headline Stratcom 2018 exposed. Stratcom refers to an apartheid security police dirty tricks propaganda unit, and the suggestion was that what we were doing was similar. The story was presented as an attempt by white media and white journalists to sabotage a black competitor and a black diamond, Dr. Survé. But the black backlash, this kind of propaganda attack on us and our journalism was also prompted by questions we had sent about an earlier listing, the IO listing, which in fact was successful. IO was the one that got away. IO listed on the 21st of December 2017, before the Sagamata attempt. And ahead of that listing, IO persuaded the PIC to invest 4.3 billion Rand for 99 million shares at 43 Rand per share. And you can see in the share price tracing on the right, this is what happened. The share is currently trading at around 3 Rand from 43 Rand at which the country's civil service pension fund invested. But the point is that Sekunjalo, IO, had raised 4.3 billion. What happened to that 4.3 billion? For that and a deep dive into unpacking financial statements, I'm going to hand over to Dewald.
Hello, just give me a minute to share screen. There we go. There we are. Okay, so my point of departure is to put aside the politics and just look at the money. We now know that we're looking at IO, the company that received 4.3 billion Rand. And we're simply asking ourselves the question, what happened to it? And what do you do when you suddenly have 4.3 billion Rand, which you really shouldn't have, but irrespective, just what do you do with it? So just to recap where this money sits. Iqbal Survé, his family company is called Sekunjalo. He owns a listed company called African Equity Empowerment Investments, and that in turn controls IO, which is where the money sits. And this will be important later. Just the basic sources of information, it's nothing very contentious. There's published financial statements. there's a market information freely available from the JSE. And then we've had to, in the past, use a couple of access to information requests, specifically in terms of the Companies Act, which allows you to get pretty thorough access to shareholder registers, in South Africa at least. Okay, so if you're looking at what people are doing with cash, the starting point is fairly obviously the cash flow statement. I don't know how many people here have never dealt with financial statements, but if you have, the cash flow statement is where I like to start. It really does show you the money coming in and the money going out. In this instance, you can see the money coming in on the left-hand side. In 2018, they're sitting with a cash balance of 4.3 billion rand. Currently, that's sitting at 2.68 billion rand. And you ask yourself, where did the money in between go, the balance? And a couple of random examples. So you can see what they do with, see that the operations, the actual business of the company, it loses money. That's a negative cash flow. But you can see that the finance income is fairly substantial. That's 256 million rand. And that is purely the interest earned on the PIC money. That's just the money sitting in a bank account earning about 8% interest, no better than a savings account you or I could open. So that's really them doing absolutely nothing. Despite losing operational money and pulling interest, they are nonetheless paying themselves significant dividends. So it's a pretty nice business to be in. Basically, you are earning interest on the PIC's money and paying all that interest to yourself as a dividend. Unfortunately, you can't keep doing that forever because you'll start eating into your cash pile, and interest rates, as we know, have been lowering. So that gig can't last forever. Another way of getting money out, if you dig into the notes, and the notes of a financial report are by far really the most important part of the report. Here, hidden deep down, you see the related party disclosures, very much the most interesting part of most financial reports. So we can see at a random assortment, really, they repaid a loan to their parent company. They invested in a company that belongs to Iqbal Survé. They paid fees to the parent company. They used sister companies for their services. This is a survey-owned events management company. And they do this in less trivial and more trivial amounts all the time. And you pay fees to your own parent company. There's another 60 million. And this is just done continuously and in small amounts and in major amounts consistently over the past 3-4 years, which really does start to add up. Then, I mean, that's just an example of how you use cash in ways that probably isn't illegal. It's just really bad corporate governance. There's a couple of other things that you can learn simply from public data. So this is a story I did in 2019 based on market data, which is just share trading data. So you saw a certain strange behavior in the IO share price. You saw about 3 months of relatively demure trading. It kind of sat at one value, which was 22 rand a share. And on this day, it just suddenly collapsed, just out of the blue. The importance of that day only became apparent lately. There was a commission inquiry into the PIC, and incidentally, as a throwaway line, we saw that there was a downside protection agreement for 22 rand, and it lasted 90 days from 19 October and hence ended on 19 January. In other words, the day the share collapsed was the end of a downside protection agreement with the PIC. Those not familiar with these agreements, basically you sign a deal. It says we guarantee the share price will stay above 22 rand, and if it doesn't, we'll pay you a penalty. And the fact that it suddenly collapsed on the day the agreement ended is kind of preliminary, I find overwhelmingly suggestive of market manipulation, that someone was artificially keeping that share above 22 Rand for 3 months. And you ask yourself, who might have an interest in doing that, or the means of doing that? Well, if you pull more market data, which is in no way secret, you'll find that there were really 5 buyers in that entire period of shares in IO. And it's unsurprising that among the big ones, you have Sekunjalo, which is Iqbal Survé, and you have Free Laws Capital, which is also Iqbal Survé. Then there's a big one, doesn't even have a proper name, it just has SA company registration name, that's what they look like. But if you look that company up, it's Iqbal Survé's brother-in-law. So basically, Iqbal Survé and his brother-in-law were practically the only people buying shares in a period when the share was, by all appearances, being manipulated. This I would not legally state this as a fact. There's a very conspicuous allegedly here at the top of my slide, but it is suggestive. And we are not the only people who think so, because about 3 months after that report, a financial regulator raided his offices on suspicion of share manipulation. So there's that. That's one kind of story you can do with financial information, and that we did do on Iqbal Survé. Another way in which the money in IO was spent is through acquisitions that don't always make sense or don't always seem all that clean. Exhibit 1 is Sizwe Africa IT. Incidentally, really the only significant real company they own or have invested in that actually does something. Incidentally, Sizwe Africa IT's claim to fame is, however, that it is currently embroiled in a tender scandal. There was a overpricing of tablets in the Eastern Cape, something to that effect that's still in court. Irrespective, they announced that they were buying this company on the stock exchange. But thin on detail, they just said we're buying 55% of the company and we're paying 165 million Rand for this 55%. The shares were being bought from 3 entities. It was being bought from Loxisource, Laxisource, and a man called Vukile Mahana. They misspelled his name in their own announcement. So we ask ourselves, who are these lucky people being paid all these millions for their shares? There's very little public information about how much is being bought from which player. So you have to kind of dig a bit. Hang on my slides. Okay, so the Reverend Mahana, we do know. He is part of the Sekunjalo family. He is the chairman of IO's parent company. He is the chairman of another Iqbal Survé company. He is also known as the chaplain general of the ANC. So when the ANC has a big shindig, he's the man who says the prayer before things get going. So he's not an unknown. But the shelf company, if you look it up, it's him as well. So he's getting a share of money that's being paid for Sizwe Africa. But then we just happened to come across some leaked documents, which shed a bit more light on this deal. This tells us whose shares are getting bought in what proportion. And it also tells us that the executives of IO at the time, who all got fired for raising alarms, had all about it. So what we learned was that Vukile was basically by himself and through that company selling 10% for 30 million, which the executives called an inflated price. He gets to keep another 10% of the company. IO then makes him the CEO of the company, even though the IO executives at the time said the terms make no sense, the valuation's over generous, and they paid a whole lot of money up front that they shouldn't have. So all told, a very bad deal that largely seems to benefit Vukile Mahana and of various Sekunjalo companies' boards, and clearly a friend of Iqbal Survé's. So that's one deal. Oh yeah, just they also threw in a bit of a contentious deal for a friend of Mahana's worth 150 million rand, which was also raised at that commission of inquiry. Just worth a mention. Then there's another acquisition, which was remarkably convoluted. Also shows you how to cleverly disguise a related party transaction. So here, an announcement, once again, buried pretty deep in the fine print of a financial statement. They announce, IO announces that it's investing 90 million in something called 4+. Now, true to type, as with the companies like the African Amazon that Sam dealt with, it's getting hyped up as this fourth industrial revolution kind of super startup incubator type thing. But even though they paid 90 million, the auditors immediately told them it's actually worth 5.5 million. That's in the financial statements, in the notes, again, always worth reading. They keep spending money on this thing, and in total they have spent 200 million buying shares in 4+, and the auditors have written down 150 million rand of that. So basically they're just throwing good money after bad, buying shares and shares and shares in this thing. It begs the question, like, what is it they're spending all this money on? Well, again, in the fine print, you find its major investment is something called Vault Africa, which is a really existing company. I was also giving Vault Africa some direct loans. So it basically is investing in a thing called Vault Africa indirectly. And Vault Africa, if you look them up, they have a website, are a media partner to all the independent newspapers. So now you find IO spending money to fund a company that works for independent media. Now, IO and independent media are legally distinct. There is no reason for the two to be related in any way whatsoever. It looks like cross-subsidization. But 4+ is doing more than that. 4+ suddenly seems to be buying all sorts of other stuff. So it's buying independent online, it's buying a stake in Loot, which is an online retailer, it's buying something called Last Mile Logistics, Africa Community Media. All these things it's buying have one thing in common: they all belong to Iqbal Survé. So up to this point, we have IO giving money to 4+, 4+ in turn using that money to buy things from Iqbal Survé. So that's a nice little circular loop of money. Okay, let's find out what all these things are. So Vault Africa, if you look them up, their name actually used to be Independent Digital Lab. And Iqbal Survé used to be a director. So basically it is an independent company, and they're pretending it isn't by funding this. Looking at all the plus investments, they're all seeming to get loans on top of being invested in. So that's 16 million written off in its entirety. There's a 15 million rand investment written off in its entirety. Last Mile gets a loan of 25.4 million written off in its entirety. So they're basically lending money to all these companies and then writing off the loans, hence expecting that it will never be repaid. So they're just giving money along to Iqbal Survé. So let's go further. We want to know precisely who is in 4+. This is a COR24 form. In South Africa, you can use this to force a company to disclose the shareholding, which we did successfully after a bit of knocking on doors. This is what the share register looks like. We find that this company originally belonged to someone called Heidi Apollos. We don't know who that is. We then find that it gets sold in its entirety to something called Women's Technology Investments. And from there, it starts issuing shares to IO Technology. It's not selling the entire company, it's issuing shares, which means it's getting money. Now, let's see where this started, because the question mark already arises. So who is Heidi, right? At this point, it still seems to be that this is an independent company of some sort that just happens to be using the money it gets from IO to buy survey companies, if you follow. Now, is Heidi Apollos truly an independent investor or person? Well, she's not. Heidi Apollos is the sister of Trisha Apollos, who is Iqbal Survé's personal assistant. So, to recap from the top, IO is investing money in a company that was created by Iqbal Survé's assistant sister, who then uses that money to buy companies that belong to Iqbal Survé. So IO money being used to buy Iqbal Survé's assets, and usually not good assets, buying the stuff that's struggling. So the PIC's money is being used to subsidize Iqbal Survé through a rather convoluted way. And that's what it looks like in a graphic form. IO on the top funds 4+. 4+ buys shares in companies that belong to Sekunjalo. Money goes to Iqbal Survé. The same happens via loans via the same company. And that is how you utilize a piggy bank. I hope that was something you could follow.
All right, do we have any questions? Great.
I don't see any.
Yeah, I mean, I think the important thing to remember is that it's like, PIC is really only managing the money on behalf of government employee pension funds. Is it purely GEPF money, Deervelt, or is it also, do they also manage other
They also
people's
have
money?
the UIF as a customer. It's the major one. So yes.
When they're like pissing away money into these companies, it's kind of, it's not like it's Iqbal Survé's own money that he's doing that with. It's kind of, money that's meant to be for people's pensions, meant to be for unemployment benefits. It's,
Yeah, I think we saw, the value of that investment from that share price collapse. The PIC invested pensioners' money at 43 Rand a share, 4.3 billion. That's now worth 3 Rand a share. So their 4.3 billion is worth how much? Deervelt, can you do the maths quickly?
But I can make a very startling observation, which is that the market worth of that company on the stock exchange is actually less than the cash it has. Which is quite astonishing. So it's basically being negatively valued.
Sure. Okay.
It's being valued as though it might get liquidated, essentially.
Well, as though some of the cash might leak out somewhere into not terribly worthwhile investments, perhaps.
I think that's also reflective of the fact that the PIC is attempting to get their money back in a very slow and drawn-out legal process.
They might actually lose.
Why would they lose?
Well, because Dr. Dan signed some really ridiculous contracts with the Sagamata failed investment, which seemingly makes it impossible for the PIC to reclaim money.
Is that another, I think, can we point people towards some of our articles as well?
That's a recent one, actually. When was that?
Yeah, so that was in a way going back to the example that kind of tipped us off about this kind of thing, the story with the Guptas, the IDC, and Shiva Uranium, where the IDC had put money up, had lent the Gupta's money to buy Shiva, and then were persuaded, instead of getting repaid, as it had originally been agreed, to accept shares in the new listed company, which was listed at an inflated price, in lieu of the debt that was owed. And Sagamata, the Sekunjalo, managed to do something similar with the PIC. Instead of those independent loans worth 2.6 billion or so, the PIC was persuaded, or Dr. Dan was persuaded, to sign a contract that converted that debt into shares in Sagamata. And although the Sagamata never listed, Sekunjalo is arguing that that contract still stands. And so that huge debt is been converted into what are virtually worthless shares.
Sure.
It's good business if you're in it. I think they're going to cut us off. So
okay. Should we, yeah, any last thoughts? Anyone want to wrap up?
No, you'll probably hear more about this later. Just come to the website.
We'll put up a couple of tweets kind of linking people to some of the articles and that kind of thing. So you can read some of the articles for yourself.
Thanks for attending.
All right.